Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to read from Exodus 8 and talk about what happens when we die. We live in a society where many people think that God is going to treat everyone the same. In other words, many people believe that after life here on earth, everyone is going to go to the same place. The Bible tells us otherwise. In this video we're going to start by looking at Exodus 8 and look at some examples of where God made distinctions between two groups of people. God brought death and destruction on the Egyptians that he did not bring on the Israelites. And then we're going to look at Matthew 25 and also Revelation 22. And those are passages that tell us that in the future, after life here on earth, God is also going to make distinctions between people. Some people are going to go to heaven and spend eternity with God. Other people are going to spend eternity in hell. And then finally we'll look at Romans 10, which tells us how we know that we can be saved from eternal destruction. Now, before we get into Exodus 8, let's review the first 7 chapters just for some context. At the very beginning of Exodus, it tells us that the Israelites went to Egypt because of a famine, and they were there for several centuries. And during that time, they prospered and became very numerous, but eventually the Egyptians turned them into slaves. And then we're told about a man named Moses. Moses was an Israelite. And when Moses was an adult, he killed an Egyptian, and so he had to flee Egypt. And he went to the land of Midian. He was there for several decades, and then God appeared to Moses in a burning bush and told Moses to go back to Egypt, talk to Pharaoh, and lead the Israelites out of their slavery. So Moses went back to Egypt, he talked to Pharaoh, but things got worse. Pharaoh made life much worse for the Israelites. At that point, Moses began performing some signs and miracles to prove that God was speaking through Moses. First, Moses threw his staff down and it became a serpent. And then Moses turned the water of the Nile River into blood. Then Moses brought a plague of frogs on the land of Egypt. Frogs were everywhere. And then Moses threw some dust into the air, and the dust turned into gnats. But throughout these signs and miracles, Pharaoh did not relent. Pharaoh did not release the Israelites, and that's where we pick up reading in Exodus chapter 8, starting at verse 20. Now Yahweh said to Moses, "Rise early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water, and say to him, 'Thus says Yahweh, let my people, the Israelites, go, that they may serve me.'" Now notice I've indented some of these lines. That's to help us understand one of the difficulties sometimes of following the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, is following the quotes within quotes. For example, here we have a quote within a quote within a quote. It starts out telling us what is happening, and then these 3 lines is the quotation of what Yahweh said to Moses. And this line is the quotation that God gave to Moses that Moses was supposed to speak to Pharaoh. And then these last 2 lines are the message that Moses was supposed to deliver to Pharaoh on behalf of Yahweh. So we have a quote within a quote within a quote. And so I've indented it to help us follow that. And you'll see that a couple other times throughout this video. Verse 21. And again, this is God's message to Pharaoh. "For if you do not let my people, the Israelites, go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and on your servants and on your people, the Egyptians, and into your houses. And the houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they dwell. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people, the Israelites, are living, so that no swarms of flies will be there, in order that you may know that I, Yahweh, am in the midst of the land." So notice the word "but." This verse is a contrast to the previous verse. The previous verse, God said he was going to bring these flies onto the Egyptians. But in this verse, God said he's going to set apart the land of Goshen. Goshen is where the Israelites were living. And flies would not be in the houses of the Israelites. And the reason for that, it says, in order that, so that Pharaoh would know. This was proof to Pharaoh that Yahweh was real and that he was in the land. Verse 23. Again, this continues God's message to Pharaoh. "I will put a division between my people, the Israelites, and your people, the Egyptians. Tomorrow this sign will occur." So notice the word division. God stated very clearly he was going to make a division between the Israelites and the Egyptians. He was going to make a distinction. He was going to treat them differently. Verse 24. Then Yahweh did so, and there came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and the houses of his servants, and the land was laid waste because of the swarms of flies in all the land of Egypt. Notice the land was laid waste. This plague was more than just an annoyance. These flies did a lot of damage to Egypt. Verse 25. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land." So notice here, Pharaoh's sort of kind of caving a little bit. He's willing to let the Israelites go, but notice the word within. Pharaoh told the Israelites to stay within the land. Pharaoh was trying to keep a little bit of control over the Israelites. But Moses said, "It is not right to do so, for we will sacrifice to Yahweh our God things that are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice things that are an abomination to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not then stone us?" So obviously the answer to that was yes. Verse 27. We must go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to Yahweh our God as he commands us. Pharaoh said, "I will let you go that you may sacrifice to Yahweh your God in the wilderness. Only, you shall not go very far away. Make supplication for me." So again, Pharaoh was giving in a little bit, but he still told them to not go far away. Pharaoh was still trying to keep control over the Israelites. Then Moses said, "Behold, I am going out from you, and I shall make supplication to Yahweh that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only, do not let Pharaoh deal deceitfully again in not letting the Israelites go to sacrifice to Yahweh." What Moses is referring to here is in previous plagues, in previous chapters of Exodus, and we covered this in previous videos, Moses brought some plagues, and Pharaoh went to Moses and said, "Hey, take the plague away and I'll let you Israelites go." And so Moses took the plague away, but then Pharaoh reneged on his agreement and did not let the Israelites go. And Moses is simply telling Pharaoh not to do that again. Verse 30. So Moses went out from Pharaoh and made supplication to Yahweh. Yahweh did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people, the Egyptians. Not one remained. But, notice the word but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the Israelites go. And so we see that Pharaoh did do that again. Pharaoh reneged on his agreement once the plague was gone. Notice the words major break. In biblical Hebrew, they did not use space to gather words into sections the way we do in English. Instead, they used letters. And at this particular point, the author of Exodus put a letter that indicates a major break. And that was to indicate that this particular passage that we've been reading about the plague of flies, that is now completed. And the next verse starts a new section, which will be a new plague. Chapter 9, verse 1. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and speak to him. Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, let my people, the Israelites, go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them, behold, the hand of Yahweh will come with a very severe pestilence on your livestock which are in the field, on the horses, on the donkeys, on the camels, on the herds, and on the flocks. But Yahweh will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing will die of all that belongs to the sons of Israel." Notice the word but. Again, this verse is a contrast to the previous verse. Notice the word distinction. God stated very clearly he was going to make a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God was intending to bring destruction, death and destruction on the Egyptians that he was not going to bring on the Israelites. Verse 5. Yahweh set a definite time, saying, "Tomorrow Yahweh will do this thing in the land." So Yahweh did this thing on the next day, and all the livestock of Egypt died. But of the livestock of the sons of Israel, not one died. Again, notice the word but, and notice the contrast. All the livestock of Egypt died, none of the livestock of Israel died. Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not even one of the livestock of Israel dead. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the Israelites go. So, notice the word hardened. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Once again, Pharaoh refused to acknowledge the plagues. Pharaoh refused to acknowledge God or his authority. Pharaoh hardened his heart and did not let the Israelites go. Notice the words major break. Again, that's the end of another section, and that's where we're going to stop reading in this video. So let's review what we've seen. We see that God sent a message to Pharaoh, and God said that he was going to make a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God intended to bring death and destruction on the Egyptians that he was not going to bring on the Israelites. And then we see that God did that very thing. He brought these plagues. He brought death and destruction on the Egyptians that he did not bring on the Israelites. Now the lesson for us is we need to pay attention when God tells us or warns us that he's going to make distinctions, because we have historical evidence that God makes distinctions, and we have evidence that God carries out his threats and promises to make distinctions in the future. So next we're going to look at some verses, first in Matthew and then in Revelation, where God tells us he's going to make distinctions after life here on earth. Let's start at Matthew 25, verse 31. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Notice the word separate. This is Jesus speaking, and he's stating very clearly that in the future, the Son of Man is going to have all the nations before him, and he's going to separate them. Some will go to his left, and some will go to his right. Verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Then he will also say to those on his left, depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. So notice the contrast. The king said to those on his right, come. He said to those on his left, depart. This tells us very clearly that after life here on earth, God is not going to treat everyone the same. Some will be invited into heaven, others will be sent away into the eternal fire. These, and the pronoun these refers to those on his left, the accursed ones. These on his left will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life. And then let's look at Revelation 22, verse 14. Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city. Outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying. So again, we see here that God is not going to treat everyone the same. Some are going to be welcomed into, they're going to enter the gates into the city. Others are going to be outside. And so the question is, what do we need to do, or how can we know that we will be welcomed into the city, that we will spend eternity in heaven, and that we will not be cast outside, that we will not be thrown into the eternal fire and into eternal punishment? The answer to that is found in Romans 10, and this is verse 9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now let me talk about the word Lord. Our society misunderstands that word. We often think that the word Lord is a synonym for God. And in this case, the meaning there is a little bit different. The Greek word that's translated Lord actually has more the idea of master or boss. And so this tells us, that in this verse, it tells us there's two conditions for being saved from eternal punishment. The first one is we have to confess that Jesus is master. And the word confess is the idea of we have to acknowledge the truth of that. And also there's an idea with that we have to submit to that. So that's the first condition, confess that Jesus is master. The second one is to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that's the Easter story. Jesus was crucified, he died, he was buried, and then he rose from the dead. And so if we confess that Jesus is master, and if we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, then we will be saved from eternal punishment. So again, just to review, we live in a society where many people think that after life here on earth, God's going to treat everyone the same and that everyone is going to go to the same place. But the Bible tells us otherwise. We saw some examples in Exodus of where in the past God made distinctions between groups of people. God brought death and destruction on the Egyptians that he did not bring on the Israelites. And the lesson to us is twofold. One, it tells us that God can and does make distinctions between groups of people. It also tells us that we need to pay attention and believe God when he tells us that he will make distinctions in the future. And so then we looked at Matthew 25 and Revelation 22, where God tells us very clearly that after life here on earth, some people will go to heaven and other people will go to hell. And then we close with Romans 10:9, which tells us how we can know that we will be saved from eternal punishment and that we will spend eternity in heaven. And that is twofold. We have to acknowledge, confess that Jesus is the Master, and we have to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. Thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. If you haven't already done so, please join my email list so that I can share future videos with you for free. My email list is a free subscription and your email address will not be sold nor given away. There are links on this video screen to take you to a sign-up page, or you can go to BibleMountain.com and click on follow. Also, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like this video and share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.